There's a place in the Mojave where the ground opened up and swallowed an entire community. Not slowly, not over decades of decay, but in a single afternoon when the warheads buried beneath the earth woke up and tore the divide in half. Before that day, this wasn't a ruin. It was a functioning courier route that connected NCR territory to the Mojave, a highway dotted with settlements, a region people called home. Then one delivery arrived, and the silos activated. The courier who made that delivery walked away. The town of Hopeville, the scavenger camps, the traders who'd just started laying down roots, they didn't. What you see now, in Lonesome Road, is what's left after the earth split open and the storms rolled in. But to understand how it died, you need to see what it was when it lived. Before the Great War, the divide was a prosperous stretch of Interstate 15 running between California and Nevada. The main settlement was Hopeville, a company town built to support the military logistics infrastructure running through the region. A few miles south sat Ashton, smaller, quieter, built around the installations the Army didn't advertise. This wasn't empty desert. Federal investment poured into the area throughout the 2060s and 70s, turning the highway into a strategic corridor. Warehouses, truck stops, maintenance facilities, all of it designed to keep supplies and personnel moving between the West Coast bases. Beneath it all, the Ashton Missile Silo Field sprawled across 40 square miles of what looked like unremarkable government land. The silos were deep, reinforced, and connected by a network of tunnels the civilian population never saw. What made this stretch of highway valuable enough to bury nuclear silos beneath it would define everything that came after. Hopeville in 2077 was everything the pre-war propaganda promised. Population just under 4,100, unemployment at 3%, schools rated excellent by federal standards. The town's economic engine was the defense contracts, the logistics jobs, the steady federal paychecks that kept the diners full and the hardware store stocked. Families moved here for stability, the kind of place where you could buy a house on a single income, where the high school football team had new uniforms every year, where the 4th of July parade stretched 11 blocks. The residents knew the military owned the land to the south, and that was fine. It meant jobs, meant investment, meant the government cared about keeping Hopeville alive. No one talked much about what was actually stored in those silos. The optimism of the era didn't leave much room for doubt. America was strong, the future was bright, and Hopeville was proof that the system worked. But the town's survival was always conditional on something the residents never saw. Beneath Hopeville and the surrounding Ashton Valley sat 37 missile silos, each housing a single LGM 118 amps Peacekeeper YCBM. The hardened launch complexes ran 80 feet below the surface, reinforced concrete and steel designed to survive a near miss. Each warhead carried 10 independently targetable re-entry vehicles. The math was simple: 370 thermonuclear warheads aimed at coordinates across China and the Soviet bloc, maintained by rotating crews of 14 airmen per site. The Air Force called it deterrence. The locals called it Tuesday. Security clearances meant the crews couldn't talk about their work, but everyone in Hopeville knew what the chain-link fences and the quarterly drills meant. You grew up within 6 miles of enough firepower to end civilization, and you learned not to think about it. The silos ran 24-hour alerts, fail-safes nested inside fail-safes, human operators standing ready to turn keys if the order ever came. It never did. The missiles sat in their tubes for 31 years, through the Anchorage campaign, through the annexation of Canada, through every border skirmish and diplomatic breakdown that pushed the world closer to the edge. The crews rotated in and out, ran their checklists, and went home to Hopeville for dinner. When October 23, 2077 arrived, those silos did something no one expected. The sirens started at 9:47 a.m. Pacific Time. Air raid warnings blared across Hopeville's municipal system, the same ones tested every first Wednesday of the month. Except this time, the radio confirmed it. Nuclear launches detected, multiple inbound. Families ran for basements, for the old civil defense shelters the town had maintained since the 1950s. The silo crews sealed themselves in their launch complexes and waited for the order to retaliate. The order never came. Communications with NORAD went dead within 4 minutes. The crews sat at their consoles, watching blank screens, unable to confirm whether their chain of command still existed. Across America, silos launched. Across China, silos launched, but the Ashton network stayed silent, 37 birds still in their nests, because no authenticated launch code ever arrived. The crews followed protocol. Without valid orders, the missiles stayed cold. Above ground, the horizon flashed white. Not close, but visible. Las Vegas, maybe, or one of the California targets. The shockwave never reached them. The fallout plumes drifted east on the prevailing winds. Hopeville's geography and the chaos of targeting priorities had created a gap in the fire. When dawn broke on October 24th, the town still stood. The roads were intact, the power grid dead but repairable, the silos undamaged and still fully armed. Surviving the war turned out to be the easy part. The first week ran on adrenaline and pre-war supplies. Hopeville's residents huddled in basements, rationing canned food, waiting for the radiation to clear and the army to arrive with relief convoys. The radio played static, the power stayed off. By November, the reality settled in cold and irreversible. No one was coming. The United States of America, the entity that had built the silos and paved the highways and written Hopeville into existence, no longer answered the phone. Winter hit hard. The town had maybe 4 months of food if they pooled everything, less if they fed everyone equally. Families started hoarding. The silo crews, trained soldiers with access to military rations and bunker supplies, became a separate class overnight. Fights broke out over generator fuel, over medicine, over who got to sleep in the warmest rooms. The mayor tried to organize a rationing council. Half the town stopped showing up to meetings after the first vote went badly. By February 2078, Hopeville had split into 6 loosely cooperating enclaves, each centered on a family or a pre-war employer. The optimism that had built the town was gone, stripped away by 4 months of cold and hunger and the creeping understanding that the old world wasn't temporarily disrupted. It was over. The silos still sat beneath them, still armed, still waiting for orders that would never come. By spring, the question wasn't whether help was coming. It was whether the town could hold itself together. The answer came in the form of salvage. The military had left behind more than silos. Supply depots lined the old highway, truck stops stocked with canned food and medicine, warehouses packed with tools and ammunition. Most of it had survived the blasts intact. Hopeville organized scavenging runs, crews of 4 or 5 moving through the ruins in shifts. They found MREs dated 2077, still edible, medical supplies in sealed crates, enough ammunition to keep the town armed for years. The military's paranoia about Soviet strikes had turned every building into a bunker, and now that paranoia was keeping people alive. A barter economy emerged fast. Medicine traded for labor, ammunition for food. One man's skill with a rifle bought his family shelter through the winter. The town council, what was left of it, tried to ration the depots, but desperation made people creative. Black markets formed, alliances shifted. By 2079, Hopeville had mapped every salvageable structure within 10 miles. They knew which buildings held food, which held fuel, which held nothing but radiation and ghoul nests. What began as scavenging would eventually become something much larger. The highway was still there. Interstate 15 ran straight through the divide, asphalt cracked, but mostly intact. Overpasses still standing, tunnels clear. The bombs had hit cities and military targets, not infrastructure in the middle of nowhere. Elsewhere in the Mojave, roads had been reduced to craters and rubble. California's freeways were impassable, choked with the wreckage of the old world. But the divide stretch of I-15 had survived. 40 miles of drivable road, cutting through terrain that would take weeks to cross on foot. The survivors didn't realize what they had at first. They saw it as a path between scavenging sites, nothing more. But a functional road through the wasteland was worth more than any single warehouse. It was a corridor, a lifeline, a route that connected the scattered remnants of civilization. The town sat at the intersection of that corridor and the old supply depots, controlling both the salvage and the path. A drivable road across the wasteland. Someone was going to notice eventually. They arrived around 2100, first in pairs, then in small caravans. Merchants from the hub, 200 miles west, hauling Brahmin, loaded with scrap and food. NCR scouts in faded uniforms, mapping routes through the desert. Prospectors who'd heard rumors of untouched military salvage and came looking for a fortune. Hopeville's survivors had goods the traders wanted: pre-war medicine, ammunition, tools that still worked. The merchants brought caps, food that wasn't 23 years old, and news. They spoke of settlements forming across California, of a new California republic organizing towns under a single flag, of raiders and worse things prowling the wastes. The first trading post opened in 2101, a fortified building on the highway where caravans could rest and barter. Within a year, 3 more followed. Hopeville wasn't just surviving anymore. It was becoming a waypoint, a place merchants marked on their maps, a stop on the route between the hub and Vegas. The scavenger economy evolved. Instead of hoarding salvage for survival, the town began stockpiling it for trade. Warehouses that once fed families now supplied caravans. The traders brought caps and goods, but they also brought word of what was rising in the West. In 2189, the new California Republic was still just shady sands and a handful of farms. By 2189, it had swallowed the boneyard, the hub, and Junktown. What started as a council of settlements became a territorial government with taxes, courts, and an army that needed feeding. Every annexed city-state meant more mouths, more soldiers, more bureaucrats drawing salaries in NCR dollars. The hub's merchant guilds could move Brahmin caravans south along the coast, but the interior routes were still raider country. You couldn't run a republic on goodwill and hope. The NCR needed highways, not just trails, but roads you could defend, patrol, and tax. Routes where a caravan didn't need 12 guards just to reach the next settlement. The kind of infrastructure that turned trade into revenue, and revenue into more territory. By 2120, the NCR's merchant companies were looking past the Mojave for the next viable route east. The Corps of Engineers arrived in 2130 with surveying equipment, armed escorts, and orders to map every mile of Highway 95 through the divide. They spent 4 months measuring gradients, testing tunnel integrity, and cataloging the salvage still sitting in warehouses. The locals watched them work, unsure if this was opportunity or the beginning of something else. The report that went back to Shady Sands ran 87 pages. Intact asphalt for 34 miles, 6 reinforced overpasses, 2 major tunnel networks that could move supply trucks in any weather, the only all-weather road between California and the Colorado River, it said. No detours through raider-held canyons, no seasonal flooding, no bottlenecks a single ambush could shut down for weeks. They noted Hopeville's population at 240, its functional water treatment plant, and the silos no one had opened yet. The final line of the infrastructure assessment read, Minimal fortification required. Existing settlement cooperative. That last word mattered more than the engineers realized when they wrote it. The survey was filed under Strategic Infrastructure, a classification that meant someone important was paying attention. The town meeting happened on a Tuesday in March 232. The NCR's territorial liaison stood at the front of Hopeville's largest salvaged building and laid out the offer. Join the Republic, accept its laws and taxes, and you get military protection, legal recognition, and infrastructure investment. Stay independent, and you're on your own when the next army rolls through. The debate ran 6 hours. Older residents remembered when Hopeville answered to no one, when the town made its own rules and kept what it earned. Younger traders saw the NCR caravans, the caps flowing west, the jobs that came with being inside the system instead of outside it. The vote was 127 to 113 in favor. On April 9, 2132, the NCR flag went up outside the old community hall. Highway 95 became Highway 15 on the new maps, designated the Long 15 in logistics reports. Hopeville became the Highway 15 Protectorate, which sounded impressive until you read the fine print about supply quotas and garrison rights. Membership came with benefits, but also obligations the town didn't fully understand yet. The NCR Office of Special Deliveries opened a branch in Hopeville in 2257, staffed by 3 clerks and a postmaster who'd transferred in from Shady Sands. Mail runs left twice weekly, carrying letters, military dispatches, and small parcels sealed with wax stamps that said priority or command authorization required. The couriers traveled in pairs, armed with service rifles and radios that only worked in line of sight. Way stations appeared every 18 miles along the route, concrete block structures with bunks, water tanks, and lockboxes for valuable cargo. Each station kept a logbook recording every courier who passed through, the time, and a one-word weather report. By 2260, the logs showed 40 to 50 transits per week, up from 8 when the route opened. High-value shipments got armed escorts, usually 4 troopers in light armor, walking alongside the courier. Pre-war medical supplies, gold certificates, replacement vacuum tubes for radio equipment. The kind of cargo that would get you killed anywhere else, but on the Divide route, bandits learned to stay clear. The NCR didn't negotiate with people who attacked the mail. For 2 decades, the Divide carried the Republic's mail, and then the nature of the cargo changed. The Long 15. That's what NCR Army Logistics called it. Formal designation for the Hopeville corridor in dispatch routing codes and quartermaster requisitions. The name came from the old highway markers, but the meaning shifted when the engineers arrived in 2268, with concrete, rebar, and a work order signed by a brigadier general. They repaired 3 collapsed overpasses using pre-war girders, scavenged from Los Angeles, cleared a 2.4-mile tunnel that had been full of rubble since the bombs fell, and fortified 7 rest stops with sandbag bunkers and 50 caliber emplacements. Travel time from the Boneyard to the Mojave outpost dropped from 11 days to 6, assuming you didn't stop to sleep more than 4 hours a night. The northern routes through Vault City territory still existed, winding through mountains and tribal land, adding a week to any trip. Caravans used them when they had time. The army didn't have time. When you needed troops or ammunition moved fast, you sent them down the Long 15, and you paid Hopeville's toll without complaint. Speed mattered, especially when the Republic started eyeing territory it had no legal claim to. Operation Sunburst. The NCR Council authorized it in January 2274. 16 votes in favor, 3 abstentions, 0 public debate. The objective was Hoover Dam, 400 miles east across desert, that belonged to 7 different tribes who hadn't agreed to anything. The plan called for 2,800 infantry, 600 support personnel, 340 tons of ammunition, 80 tons of rations, and 12 pieces of field artillery that each weighed more than a Brahmin could pull. General Corwin Lee, commanding officer of the Mojave Expeditionary Force, stood in a Hopeville warehouse in March and told the town council the Long 15 would see 20 to 30 supply convoys per week for the next 6 months. He didn't ask permission. The contract Hopeville signed in 2264 had a clause about military necessity, buried on page 9, that gave the NCR authority to commandeer infrastructure during wartime operations. The convoys started rolling in April, trucks when they had fuel, Brahmins when they didn't, and on 3 occasions, entire companies of infantry marching 18 miles per day with full packs. The divide's population doubled overnight, with soldiers, teamsters, and camp followers who sold everything from bootleg whiskey to pre-war comic books. Hopeville's Inn started renting beds in 8-hour shifts. Every convoy that rolled east through the divide carried the weight of the Republic's largest gamble. Ashton had been a ghost town for 200 years. By late 2274, it housed 312 NCR personnel. The Army Corps of Engineers gutted pre-war warehouses and turned them into reinforced barracks. They cleared the highway rubble and built a motor pool for 40 truck convoys at a time. The ammunition depot went up in 6 weeks. Thick concrete walls and sandbag berms surrounding stacks of 308, 5.56, and artillery shells bound for the front. Ashton became the resupply point every eastbound convoy hit before the final push to the dam. Water tankers, field hospitals, even a makeshift commissary selling cigarettes and canned beans at markup. The town's original street grid was still visible under the dust. Engineers followed it when they ran new electrical lines from Hopeville's generator. But the old municipal buildings didn't match the maps. Basements went deeper than they should have. Concrete foundations were twice as thick as any civilian structure needed. The Army engineers rebuilding Ashton kept stumbling across sealed doors that shouldn't have been there. In March 2275, Chief Hanlon authorized a classified survey of the Ashton site. 3 ordnance specialists from the Office of Science and Industry descended into a sublevel the engineers had breached during foundation work. They found a missile silo. Then they found 5 more. The ICBMs were still in their tubes, 60 feet of pre-war steel and composite casing pointed at the sky. The warheads were live, plutonium cores intact after 2 centuries in climate-controlled storage. The missile fuel, a stable hypergolic mix, measured at 87% nominal capacity. Every silo had backup power, dormant but functional. The survey team's report went directly to Hanlon and President Kimball's science advisors. It was stamped top secret and filed in a vault in Shady Sands. The silos represented enough firepower to glass half the Mojave. The NCR had stumbled onto a strategic asset that predated the Republic itself. What the NCR did with that information would remain classified for years, but they didn't disarm the silos. Hopeville didn't know about the missiles. What they knew was that NCR contracts were paying 3 times what scavenger work ever had. The population hit 890 by 2276. A former followers' medic opened a clinic. 2 new merchants set up shop selling tools, canvas, and Brahmin leather to anyone with coin. The inn expanded into the building next door. Families who'd spent a generation moving between camps started talking about permanent homes. Kids born in the divide didn't remember anything else. The convoys rolled through like clockwork, 6 days a week, and every one of them needed food, repairs, or a place to sleep. By 2277, Hopeville had a functioning economy that didn't rely on picking through rubble. The NCR flag flew over the old missile silo, the one turned into a meeting hall. People started using the word future without irony. The divide had gone from a death trap to a trade route to something that almost resembled civilization. For 5 years, Hopeville looked like a success story, right up until the Legion crossed the Colorado. In 2277, Caesar's Legion crossed the Colorado in force. They took Fortification Hill in 3 days, fortified the east bank, and pushed straight for Hoover Dam. The NCR had faced raiders, fiends, scattered warbands. This was different. The First Battle of Hoover Dam cost the Republic 107 soldiers and proved the Legion wasn't going anywhere. General Oliver pulled back, dug in, and started screaming for reinforcements. Problem was, the front line sat 200 miles east of the nearest major NCR garrison. The Long 15 ran through Raider territory and open desert, where Legion scouts could pick off convoys one at a time. The I-15 was longer, slower, more exposed. That left one option. The divide went from useful to irreplaceable in a single week. Every NCR soldier, every bullet, every meal headed for the front lines had to pass through the divide. By late 2277, convoys were running through Hopeville every 8 hours. Troop transports heading east, medevac caravans limping west with wounded strapped to Brahmin carts, supply trucks loaded with ammunition, rations, water purification tablets, and body bags. Ashton's depots overflowed. Hopeville's way stations ran 24-hour shifts, refueling vehicles, rotating drivers, processing manifests under floodlights jury-rigged from salvaged Poseidon energy generators. The town's population doubled, with NCR logistics personnel, mechanics, and armed escorts who slept in shifts and left within 12 hours. The divide's roads held, barely. Caravans kicked up dust storms you could see from 5 miles out. Repair crews patched the old-world asphalt every week, racing against the weight of armored transports that concrete from 2077 was never designed to carry. The infrastructure strained, but it worked. Hopeville became the logistical artery, keeping the Mojave campaign alive. Most of what moved through the divide was standard military cargo, but not all of it. People in Hopeville started noticing a pattern. Certain convoys rolled through under heavier guard than troop transports carrying 40 soldiers. No visible cargo, tarps lashed tight over flatbeds, and no manifests posted at the depot the way NCR regulations required. These convoys arrived on schedules known only to the senior officers. They refueled in isolated sections of the way station, guards turning away anyone without clearance. Drivers wouldn't talk, wouldn't even make eye contact with the locals who'd been feeding them for 2 years. Speculation ran through town like wildfire. Experimental energy weapons from the Brotherhood War, classified intelligence on Legion movements, maybe something pulled from a vault, the kind of old-world tech the NCR locked away and pretended didn't exist. The guards stayed silent, and the convoys kept moving. The truth was worse than any of the guesses. The NCR inherited more than territory when they crushed the enclave at Navarro in 2242. They inherited an archive, power armor the Rangers stripped off dead soldiers, energy weapons still warm from the fighting, and filing cabinets full of access codes to installations the United States built before the bombs fell. The Office of Science and Industry spent the next 37 years cataloging every surviving node in the old defense network, every bunker, every silo, every hardened command post scattered across what used to be the western states. Most were collapsed or flooded. Some had been looted decades earlier. A few were still operational, locked behind security protocols written by engineers who died in 2077. The OSI kept the list classified, updated it every fiscal year, and marked each site by strategic value and accessibility. Ashton's silos appeared in the 2276 survey as high priority, structurally intact, and beneath an active settlement the NCR already controlled. One of those nodes was buried directly beneath Ashton, and in 2279, the order came down to activate it. The Ashton silos were part of a networked automated launch-on warning system designed to retaliate even if Washington, NORAD, and every command bunker in the chain had been vaporized. The system required two things to fire: confirmation of an incoming strike detected by satellite or ground radar, and a valid authentication code transmitted from a surviving authority node. On October 23, 2077, the sensors registered the launches. The missiles armed, the targeting data loaded, the countdown timers spun up to T-4 minutes. But the authentication code never arrived. Whoever was supposed to send it died before they could, or the transmission failed, or the failsafe worked exactly as designed and prevented a retaliatory launch that would have added 84 more warheads to the fire already consuming the world. The silos stayed dormant for 202 years, fuel stable, targeting computers in standby, waiting for a code that would never come, until the NCR found the manual override sequence in a filing cabinet at Navarro and decided 84 intercontinental ballistic missiles were too valuable to leave buried. The NCR didn't want to launch the missiles. They wanted to control the system that could. The operation had a name: Project Charon. The OSI chose it for the ferryman who carried souls across the river, though no one on the engineering team thought the symbolism was funny. The objective was integration, not annihilation. Reactivate the Ashton Network's command and control infrastructure, bypass the automated protocols, and place the silos under NCR strategic command. It wasn't about conquest. The Legion was 50 miles east of the Colorado. The Brotherhood had gone silent, but not extinct, and every intelligence brief out of the Mojave suggested the war for Hoover Dam would decide whether the NCR survived the next decade. A credible second strike capability, 84 missiles aimed at wherever the enemy called home, might be the only thing that kept the bear alive if the campaign went wrong. The convoy routes, the guards, the specialists rotating through Ashton every 6 weeks, it was all feeding Project Charon. The town thought it was being protected. It was being used as cover for the most dangerous reactivation the OSI had ever attempted. The engineers tasked with the reactivation were working with 200-year-old systems no one fully understood. In March 2280, Dr. Elise Navarro arrived in Ashton with 4 OSI technicians and 16 crates of pre-war decryption equipment. She'd spent 12 years studying enclave data archives, specializing in the command networks that had linked America's nuclear infrastructure before the bombs fell. If anyone could reactivate a dormant missile silo, the OSI believed it was her. Her team set up in the silo complex and worked in 18-hour shifts. They bypassed 3 independent fail-safe circuits, restored power to the launch control mainframe, and mapped 67% of the authentication protocols. By November, they'd isolated the primary command interface, a pre-war terminal system that still responded to input after 103 years in standby mode. The work was meticulous and glacially slow. Every subsystem had redundancies. Every connection had to be traced manually through conduits the original engineers hadn't bothered to label. Navarro's notes from this period described the system as elegant, paranoid, and disturbingly intact. What Navarro's team didn't know was that the system wasn't just automated, it was designed to be tamper-resistant. The authentication requirement was the core problem. The silo network had been built to accept launch commands only after receiving a 6-part authorization code, each part held by a different link in the Strategic Air Command chain. The Enclave archives contained 3 of those codes. The other 3 had died with their holders in October 2077. Navarro proposed a bypass, using Enclave decryption tools to override the missing segments and force the system to accept partial authentication. It was risky. The pre-war military had anticipated exactly this kind of intrusion, and the system specifications referenced a security protocol that would activate if unauthorized access was detected. but the specifications didn't describe what that protocol actually did. The OSI leadership approved the attempt in late November. They were under pressure from NCR Command. The Legion was consolidating territory 90 miles east, and the window for strategic deterrence was closing. Navarro ran simulations for 3 weeks, testing the bypass logic against every failure mode she could imagine. Navarro believed the protocol was a lockout. She had no idea it was an escalation. The first bypass attempt happened on December 11, 2280, at 0340 hours. Navarro's team fed the 3 recovered codes into the system and used enclave decryption algorithms to generate plausible substitutes for the missing segments. The system rejected the input cleanly. No alarms, no cascade failures. They adjusted the algorithm and tried again at 0710. Same result. The third attempt came at 1420. The system hesitated for 4 seconds before rejecting the input, a response delay Navarro interpreted as progress. She refined the decryption parameters and initiated the fourth attempt at 2153. This time, the system accepted the initial handshake. Then something deep in the launch control mainframe woke up. A subsystem Navarro hadn't mapped came online. The silo's internal status displays began cycling through pre-launch diagnostic checks. The team tried to abort, but the commands weren't processing. The system had locked them out and was now running autonomously, following protocols written by engineers who'd assumed any unauthorized access meant one thing: the enemy had breached the facility. The silo network interpreted the bypass as an enemy infiltration attempt and responded accordingly. The protocol was simple, brutal, and entirely logical to the people who designed it in 2076. If an enemy force seized a missile facility, the last thing you wanted was your own nuclear arsenal turned against you. So the system was programmed with a fail-safe. Any unauthorized access to the launch computers would trigger an immediate arming sequence. The warheads would activate, run through their pre-launch diagnostics, and begin a countdown, not to launch, to detonate in place. The idea was scorched earth. Deny the enemy their prize by destroying the facility, the missiles, and everyone inside it. It was a Cold War solution to a Cold War problem, written into the code by engineers who never imagined the scenario playing out 200 years later with no enemy in sight. The Hopeville silos weren't interpreting the bypass as a mistake or a malfunction. They saw it as proof of hostile infiltration. The arming sequences initialized across 14 warheads simultaneously, each one beginning its diagnostic cycle. The timers synchronized at 90 seconds. Navarro's team had 90 seconds to abort before the countdown became irreversible. Navarro screamed the abort order the second she understood what was happening. Her lead technician, a man named Garrett, who'd served at Navarro Air Base before the war, physically yanked cables from the launch computer housings. Another specialist cut primary power to the silo control station. The countdown didn't pause. The system was hardened against exactly this kind of response. Backup batteries kicked in automatically. Redundant processors took over the moment the primaries lost connection. The engineers had anticipated sabotage, jamming, electromagnetic pulses. They'd built a system that would complete its mission even if the facility was falling apart around it. At T-minus 45 seconds, Garrett looked at Navarro and shook his head. At T-minus 30, she gave the only order left: full evacuation. The team grabbed what they could, left the rest, and ran for the surface access tunnel. Behind them, the countdown ticked through 20, 15, 10. They made it to the surface with 11 seconds to spare, just in time to realize the warheads weren't going to launch. The countdown hit 0. Navarro braced for the shockwave. Nothing happened. The silo complex sat silent beneath Hopeville. 14 armed warheads sitting in their tubes. Diagnostics complete. Timers expired. No detonation. No fireball. Just the hum of the ventilation system. and the distant sound of wind across the divide. For 6 hours, Navarro's team stayed topside, monitoring seismic sensors and radiation detectors for any sign the warheads had gone off underground. Nothing registered. OSI leadership convened an emergency conference over the radio net. Half the brass argued the protocol had failed, that the warheads were duds or the detonators had corroded past functionality. The other half insisted the system was still processing, that the danger wasn't over. Navarro pushed for an immediate evacuation of Ashton, 6 miles south. Get the civilians out, establish a perimeter, treat the silos as live ordnance until they understood what had gone wrong. Her CO, a colonel named Drummond, denied the request. He called it an overreaction, said they couldn't evacuate a town of 180 people every time a pre-war system glitched. The warheads hadn't failed. They were waiting for a final input the system never explained. The Enclave specialist found the answer 3 days before the NCR pulled him out. Buried in the silo's authentication logs was a failsafe the designers built in 2076, back when they worried about Soviet infiltration of military networks. The system required physical delivery of a reset code to the central command node before it would execute any final order, stand down, or launch. Remote abort was disabled by design. If an enemy compromised your communications, you didn't want them stopping a justified retaliation. The code had to arrive in person, verified by biometric scan and a pre-war encryption key, then input directly into the node's terminal. Only then would the warheads power down or fire. The specialist documented it, sent the report to Shady Sands, noted the command node was somewhere in the divide's infrastructure, but he'd need 2 more weeks to locate it. There was one problem. No one in the NCR knew what the reset code was, where the command node was, or that any of this was even required. The courier was a freelance contractor, one of maybe 40 independents the NCR used to move mail and small cargo along the Long 15, Hopeville to Mojave outpost and back, 6 to 8 runs a month, paid by the delivery. It was mundane work. Mail pouches for the garrison, personal effects soldiers ordered from New California, replacement gaskets for water purifiers, antibiotics for the clinic. The divide was the midpoint, a place to resupply and sleep before the push south. Most contractors knew the route by heart. The courier had made it 47 times in 14 months, rarely saw anything worse than a few vipers or a rock slide. The NCR liked reliability. You showed up on time, you kept your manifests clean, you got steady work. On March 2nd, 2281, the courier accepted a job that looked like every other delivery they'd ever made. The package was a sealed NCR military container, 11 centimeters by 18 centimeters, weight logged at 340 grams. It was marked Classified Courier Shipment, requisition code NCRO 7743M, bound for the Mojave Outpost's intelligence liaison. The courier never opened it. Opening classified mail was breach of contract and a court-martial offense if the contents were military. They had no reason to. Half the shipments out of Shady Sands were coded that way. Dispatches and intelligence summaries the brass didn't want read by every caravan guard between here and the Mojave. The manifest listed it as routine classified correspondence. The courier loaded it into their pack alongside 14 other parcels, signed the requisition form, collected the 120 cap deposit, standard job, standard route. Inside that container was a pre-war data chip recovered from Enclave archives, flagged for OSI review. The chip had been sitting in a rusted filing cabinet in an Enclave bunker near Navarro when NCR forces overran the position in 2280. Some grunt pulled it out, tagged it as pre-war tech, and it made its way through the salvage chain to an OSI records facility in the hub. The clerk who logged it into inventory saw a jumble of encrypted file signatures and Department of Defense metadata, flagged it for analysis, moved on to the next crate. What she didn't recognize was the authentication header. The chip wasn't storage, it was a key, a command node credential designed to interface with hardened military receivers, the exact type the Ashton Missile Complex had been waiting 200 years to detect. It should have gone to a lab in Shady Sands, where someone might have cracked the encryption and realized what they had. Instead, a routing manifest got updated with the wrong destination code. The chip was supposed to go to an OSI lab in Shady Sands. A clerical error rerouted it east. The courier left Mojave Outpost on the morning of March 3, 2281. Standard westbound run through the Divide, a route they'd walked dozens of times. By early afternoon, they were passing through Ashton, a brief stop to drop mail at the depot and top off water before pushing on toward Hopeville. The package sat in their courier bag, wrapped in NCR supply wax paper, stamped with an OSI requisition number. No weight to it, no hum, no heat, nothing that would make you look twice. Just another delivery in a long string of deliveries, one foot in front of the other, across cracked asphalt and sand. They didn't open it. Protocol was clear, and there was no reason to. The chip inside was inert, its circuits cold, no power source to wake it. What no one realized was that the chip didn't need to be opened, it just needed to be close. Beneath Ashton's ruins, 40 feet down in a concrete vault that had survived 200 years of neglect, a command node receiver had never stopped listening. It was built to detect one thing, the unique EM signature of an authentication key broadcasting on a specific military frequency. Detection radius, half a mile. No human input required. When the courier walked through Ashton that afternoon, the chip in their bag emitted a faint carrier wave, passive RF leakage from its unpowered circuits. The receiver locked on. Signal confirmed. Authentication key detected. The silo network interpreted this exactly as designed. Code delivery confirmation. The system had been built with one final safeguard, a dead man's switch, for a scenario where the reset code arrived, but command authority had collapsed. If the key was present, but not manually entered, the override would never happen. The system executed its final instruction. If the code was delivered, but not manually entered, within 4 hours, default to detonation. The timer began at 4:34 p.m., March 3, 2281. The courier was 11 miles west of Ashton, following the old road toward Hopeville, the data chip still tucked in their satchel, alongside maps and ration tins. The silo network entered its final arming sequence, charging capacitors, cycling fuel pumps, running through pre-ignition diagnostics designed 200 years earlier. At Ashton, the base carried on. The morning's alarm had been logged as a false trigger. The all-clear issued at noon. Lieutenant Navarro was in Shady Sands by then, 3 hours into typing her incident report at NCR headquarters. The reset code sat in a canvas bag on a Brahmin, riding west at 3 miles per hour. No warning lights activated. The protocol was designed to stay silent during the countdown, preventing enemy interception of launch preparation signals. The system had executed thousands of diagnostics since 2077, and every one had been a drill. The courier reached Hopeville at 4:47 p.m., stopped for food and resupply, and was back on the road by 5:15. The courier crossed the western edge of the Divide at 6:02 p.m., the old road descending into California scrubland. By 6:30, they were past the last crumbling highway markers, the Divide's wind and dust fading behind them. The delivery was routine, a 140-mile run from New Vegas to an NCR supply depot in Barstow. They arrived at 7:50 p.m. The package was signed for by a quartermaster named Chen, who logged it as general correspondence and placed it on a shelf alongside 47 other parcels waiting for morning distribution. The data chip never left its envelope. In Ashton, the countdown reached T-minus 30 minutes at 8:04 p.m. The courier collected their payment, 75 caps, and left the depot. At 8:24 p.m., the silo network sent its final abort query to Ashton's command terminal. No human operator responded. The system logged the silence, verified all detonation safeties were cleared, and began the terminal countdown sequence. At 8:34 p.m. on March 3, 2281, the silo network executed its detonation order. 127 warheads detonated in their silos beneath Ashton. The missiles didn't launch. They ruptured, contained explosions channeled upward through reinforced shafts designed to direct launch thrust. Each shaft became a shaped charge, focusing 300 kilotons of force into a column of superheated plasma that carved through 60 feet of rock and concrete in 0.4 seconds. The town vaporized. The surface installation, the barracks, the command bunker, 140 personnel, all converted to ash and vapor before the shockwave formed. The blast punched through the divide surface in 127 points simultaneously, the ground rupturing along a 4-mile line. Seismic sensors in Hopeville registered a magnitude 7.2 event at 8:34:03 p.m. The shock wave traveled through the divide's geological faults at 4 miles per second, fractures that had been stable since the Tertiary period, suddenly shearing under pressures they'd never been designed to withstand. The old world had built their silos in a dormant rift valley, assuming the war would be fought in the sky. The first warheads triggered a chain reaction no one had predicted. The divide straddled the southern San Andreas fault system, a geological boundary already compromised by 200 years of background radiation and subsurface instability from the Great War. When the warheads detonated in sequence, the seismic energy didn't dissipate. It channeled directly into pre-existing fracture zones. The resulting earthquake measured magnitude 8.1, lasting 97 seconds. The ground split along fault lines that had been dormant since 1857, opening fissures 40 feet wide in some places. Highway 95 collapsed into newly formed canyons, sections of asphalt tilting vertically as the bedrock beneath them simply vanished. The Hopeville tunnels caved in within the first 30 seconds, thousands of tons of rock crushing the lower maintenance levels. Ashton's foundations cracked, buildings that had survived nuclear war tilting at angles that made them unrecognizable. The supply depots built into the canyon walls sheared away completely, tumbling into the new ravines. Seismographs at Camp Charon registered the event as originating from an uncharted epicenter, the readings so violent that NCR geologists initially classified it as a nuclear test. The earthquake was only the beginning. The warheads had fractured the groundwater table. Beneath the divide lay a pressurized aquifer system dating back to the Pleistocene, water trapped under impermeable rock for 10,000 years. The warhead blasts and subsequent quake ruptured the caprock in 14 locations. Superheated water at 280 degrees Fahrenheit flashed instantly to steam. The pressure wave from the phase change was equivalent to a secondary explosion, carving vertical shafts through already fractured bedrock. Steam geysers erupted along the entire length of the divide, some reaching 200 feet in height, the mineral-laden vapor coating everything in a fine crystalline dust. The canyon walls, now unsupported from below and destabilized by seismic shear, began collapsing in cascade failures. Entire cliff faces peeled away, exposing layers of Mesozoic sandstone that hadn't seen daylight in geological epochs. The divide transformed into a maze of unstable towers and boiling vents, the ground beneath literally hollowed out. NCR scouts attempting to approach from the west reported hearing the steam explosions from 30 miles away, a rhythmic thunder that continued for 6 hours as different aquifer chambers breached in sequence. And then the wind arrived. The warhead detonations and ground ruptures created a thermal anomaly visible on pre-war weather satellites, still transmitting fragmentary data. Superheated air, rising from the fractured Earth, formed a massive convection cell, a low-pressure zone that pulled cold Mojave air inward at velocities exceeding 80 miles per hour. The Divide's canyon geography acted as a natural wind tunnel, compressing and accelerating the airflow. What formed wasn't a temporary weather event, but a self-sustaining atmospheric engine. The heat from exposed magma chambers and radioactive decay providing continuous fuel. The storm system locked into place within 12 hours of the initial detonation. Winds howled through the ruins at hurricane force, the constant roar drowning out everything else. Debris became projectiles, pre-war signage and sheet metal shearing through concrete. The storm carved new channels through the landscape, sandblasting the buildings that remained standing until their surfaces were smooth and featureless. Meteorologists at Camp Gulf recorded barometric anomalies consistent with a Category 3 hurricane centered over a landlocked desert, a phenomenon that violated every predictive model they had. The storm didn't just reshape the weather, it weaponized the radiation. The nuclear material didn't settle, it rose on thermal columns into the storm cell, where cyclonic winds trapped it in a closed circulation pattern between the canyon walls. Particulate matter from 23 detonations, each carrying strontium-90, cesium-137, and iodine-131, began cycling through the Divide's atmosphere at wind speeds exceeding 87 miles per hour. The rad clouds formed in irregular patterns, concentrated pockets of airborne fallout that moved through the ruins like living things. Dosimeter readings inside these storms registered between 840 and 1200 rads per hour, enough to deliver a lethal dose in under 30 minutes. The clouds didn't dissipate, they orbited. By hour 6, the Divide had become a closed radiation system. Fallout that would normally disperse across hundreds of square miles stayed confined within a 14-mile stretch of canyon, recycled endlessly by the storm. Background radiation in the ruins settled at 127 rads per hour, with periodic spikes to 400 when a cloud passed overhead. Camp Gulf's radiation officer calculated that the Divide now held a higher sustained rad count than the glowing sea, higher than the Divide itself during the Great War. The storm had turned a supply route into the Mojave's permanent hot zone. Hopeville, 3 miles north of the epicenter, had 4 minutes of warning. The earthquake hit first, magnitude 6.8, centered directly beneath the warhead cache. Buildings that had stood for 204 years sheared off their foundations. Water mains ruptured. The NCR Garrison Tower, 11 stories of pre-war steel, folded at the 4th floor and came down across Main Street. People ran into the streets, which was exactly the wrong move. The roar of the detonations reached them 14 seconds before the shockwave, a sound like the sky tearing open. Mothers grabbed children. Merchants abandoned their stalls. The old Junction bar emptied in 8 seconds, patrons stumbling over each other toward doors that led nowhere safe. Then the shockwave arrived. Not wind, not air, but a physical wall of overpressure traveling at 780 miles per hour divya. It vaporized the southern third of town instantly. The middle third burned. Wooden structures exploded into shrapnel. Concrete walls 18 inches thick crumbled like dried clay. The firestorm came next, a thermal pulse that ignited everything combustible within 2.7 miles. Skin blistered, clothing flashed to ash. People who'd made it 30 feet from their homes became shadows burned into the pavement behind them. Of Hopeville's 1,247 residents, 31 survived the initial blast by being in the deepest sub-basements. The basements became tombs. Reinforced concrete held, but the buildings above collapsed inward, sealing the survivors under 40 tons of rubble. The air thickened with pulverized asbestos, lead dust, and aerosolized radiation. Dosimeters, for those who had them, climbed past 200 rads in the first hour. Outside, the storm screamed. Rescue was a fantasy. The Long 15 had ceased to exist as a concept. Camp Golf knew Hopeville was gone, but had no idea anyone lived. The 31 had water from broken pipes, darkness, and each other. 12 died in the first 24 hours from crush injuries and internal bleeding. Radiation sickness took the next wave. Nausea, then hemorrhaging, then organ failure as bone marrow shut down. By hour 48, 19 were dead. The remaining 12 tried to dig upward, but every shovelful of rubble brought down 2 more. The storm didn't stop. The rads didn't drop. At 72 hours, 6 were left. They stopped digging up and started digging down, into maintenance tunnels that predated the war, following the sound of running water through the dark. The 6 who lasted longer did so by going deeper, into tunnels that shouldn't have saved anyone. The thing about radiation is that it kills you in stages. First the nausea, then the burns, then the organs shut down one by one until you're gone. What happened to the survivors in those tunnels didn't follow that script. The Divide's atmosphere had been saturated with particulate from dozens of warheads, a specific isotopic cocktail that hadn't existed anywhere else in the wasteland. It kept cellular regeneration active even as tissue necrotized, creating a feedback loop where the body kept rebuilding what the rads kept destroying. The survivors didn't heal, and they didn't die. By week 3, the 6 who emerged from the tunnels weren't recognizable as human. Skin flayed down to muscle and bone, faces stripped to skulls, but still breathing, still moving, still aware enough to scream. They wrapped themselves in whatever fabric they could find, NCR fatigues and Legion wraps torn from the dead, and they wandered the canyons like ghosts with nowhere to haunt. The marked men, as Ulysses would later name them, retained enough memory to maintain their weapons, enough instinct to attack on sight, but no capacity for anything resembling mercy or reason. What kept them alive wasn't mercy. It was the Divide, refusing to let them die. NCR scouts reached the Divide's western approach 11 hours after the detonation, following standard disaster response protocols. They found the Ashton Highway buckled into a 40-foot fissure, radiation readings at 8,550 roentgens per hour, and storm winds clocking 90 miles per hour that made aerial reconnaissance impossible. Search and rescue launched anyway. 3 vertibird sorties attempted overflights on day 1, all forced back by zero visibility and wind shear that nearly tore the rotors off the lead bird. Ground teams in hazmat gear made it 200 yards into the outer canyons before dosimeters redlined and the wind started stripping the seals off their suits. For 72 hours they kept trying, rotating in fresh teams, mapping what they could see from the perimeter, listening on every radio frequency for distress calls that never came. On day 4, Chief Hanlon personally ordered the operation suspended. 47 NCR personnel confirmed dead, 198 missing and presumed, 0 survivors recovered. The Divide was reclassified from disaster zone to exclusion zone, the perimeter marked with radiation warning signs and concrete barriers, and patrols were redirected to enforce the cordon. Chief Hanlon's classified report concluded the disaster was a geological event triggered by seismic instability, making no mention of the silos. The Office of Science and Industry received Navarro's field report 6 hours before Hanlon's assessment hit President Kimball's desk. 3 analysts read the telemetry data, cross-referenced the seismic signatures with known nuclear detonation profiles, and reached the same conclusion within 20 minutes. The courier had triggered pre-war warheads, and the NCR had sent them into a weapons cache nobody knew existed. Director Hildern made the call personally. All Project Charon files were upgraded to Security Level 6, restricted to OSI directors and the Office of the President. Navarro's reports were archived under geological survey data, 14 layers deep in filing systems that would take a FOIA request 8 years to process. The official narrative was drafted, approved, and disseminated to NCR territorial governors within 36 hours. The logic was airtight. Admitting the NCR had accidentally detonated a pre-war nuclear stockpile would trigger Senate inquiries, criminal investigations, and political firestorms that could collapse Kimball's administration. It would validate every Legion propaganda broadcast about NCR incompetence, spook every settlement along the Long 15, and gain the Republic absolutely nothing. So the divide became an earthquake. The casualties became a tragedy of nature, and the supply route became a loss the NCR could absorb without explaining why. Only a handful of people knew the truth, and most of them wanted it to stay buried. The courier who delivered that package never knew. They dropped it off at Ashton, collected their caps, and moved on to the next job. Standard run, standard pay, nothing worth remembering. Days later, they heard about the earthquake that buried the divide. They probably felt bad for the folks who'd been caught in it, the way you feel bad when you hear about any wasteland tragedy. Then they picked up another contract and kept moving. The divide was just one more route that went dead, one more settlement swallowed by the Mojave's endless cruelty. The courier had no reason to connect a delivery job to a disaster hundreds of miles away. The guilt would come later, much later, when someone finally explained what they'd been carrying and where it had gone. But someone else had been watching the courier's route that day, and they understood exactly what had happened. Ulysses was a frumentarius, one of Caesar's deep-cover scouts, and he'd spent months mapping NCR supply lines through the Mojave. The divide had caught his attention early. A fortified route, a growing settlement, infrastructure the Republic was actually maintaining. He'd been shadowing convoys through Ashton, watching the traffic patterns, counting the guards. The divide wasn't just a supply route to him. It was something rarer, a place where the old world's roads and the wasteland survivors were building something that might actually last. He saw the courier pass through Ashton that day. He was at the divide's northern edge, close enough to feel the ground shake when the warheads went off. And afterward, when the NCR locked down the site, he found a way in and saw the package manifest, saw the EDE unit's routing data, saw exactly what had triggered the detonators. Ulysses had found his nation in the divide's promise and watched the courier unknowingly destroy it. The strategic fallout hit the NCR within weeks. Every convoy heading to the Mojave had been routed through the divide because it was fast, it was secure, and it bypassed Legion raiding territory. Now that route was gone, buried under thousands of tons of radioactive rubble. Supply lines had to swing north through the mountain passes, adding 18 to 23 days to convoy times depending on weather. Ammunition shipments that used to arrive weekly now came monthly. Reinforcements that could have reached the dam in 9 days took a month, and that was if the Legion didn't hit them on the longer exposed stretches. Caesar's scouts noted every delay, every rerouted convoy, every supply shortage at NCR forward positions. The loss of the divide didn't cause the NCR's overextension in the Mojave, but it made it worse at exactly the wrong time, in the months leading up to the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. The divide didn't just kill a town, it reshaped the balance of power across the Mojave. Over the next 2 years, the divide's geology settled into a new equilibrium. The storm system became permanent, a self-sustaining loop of ionized particles and dust kicked up by the warheads. But its patterns grew predictable. Radiation levels plateaued at 800 to 1200 rads per hour in the open, lethal for unprotected humans, but survivable for a few hours with a good rad suit and enough rad-X. The canyons remained impassable to caravans. Twisted overpasses and collapsed highway sections formed a maze that killed any attempt at vehicle transit. But on foot, with the right equipment, and a willingness to navigate through the marked men's territory, the divide became navigable again, at least for the desperate or the insane. Scavengers began probing the edges in late 2281, looking for pre-war military tech in the wreckage. Most died within 48 hours. A few made it deeper, into the old commissary and the supply depots near Hopeville, and brought back functional weapons, ammunition, and reports of something worse than the marked men waiting in the ruins. And then the missiles started moving. One silo had survived the detonation partially intact. Silo 11, buried 180 feet below the Hopeville missile base, had taken the shockwave at an angle. Its primary structure cracked but held. The missile inside, a Mark 7 nuclear warhead with a 200 kiloton yield, remained functional, its arming systems damaged but operational. The launch control computer had been corrupted by the electromagnetic pulse from the other detonations. It was stuck in a repeating error loop, cycling through targeting protocols every 6 hours, trying to execute the launch order it had received on October 23, 2077, and never completed. The system would lock onto a target, run diagnostics, detect the fault in the missile's guidance systems, abort, and start over. For 4 years after the divide's destruction, the silo sat there cycling through its broken routines, the missile's fuel slowly degrading, the warhead's plutonium core still viable. The computer didn't know the war had ended 204 years ago. It only knew it had a launch order, and every 6 hours it tried again. Ulysses found the silo in 2282 and realized the divide still had one last way to spread its destruction. Ulysses had been watching the divide since its collapse, moving through the ruins, studying the marked men, searching for meaning in the disaster. When he found Silo 11, he saw an answer. He would repair the launch systems, bypass the error loop, retarget the missile at the population centers of both the NCR and Caesar's Legion. He spent months scavenging parts from the other destroyed silos, rebuilding the guidance array, stabilizing the fuel lines. The work was meticulous, almost religious. He wasn't just restoring a weapon. He was preparing a judgment, a final proof that the nations fighting over the Mojave were building on sand, that their symbols and flags meant nothing when measured against the consequences of old-world ambition. And he would make the courier watch, the one who'd carried the package, who'd destroyed his hope without even knowing it existed, would be forced to witness what their ignorance had enabled. The divide would deliver its message, not through radiation storms or marked men, but through the same fire that had created it, sent back at the nations that had used it and discarded it. By 2283, Ulysses had restored enough of the launch systems to make his threat real. The transmission reached the courier in 2283, delivered through EDE, the iBot they'd repaired months earlier. Ulysses' voice crackled through decades-old speakers, calling them back to the one place they couldn't remember visiting. The divide wasn't just ruins anymore. It was an accusation. Walking back through the Ashton Missile Silo Access Road, the courier saw what their delivery had done. Twisted highways hung in the air, NCR Ranger helmets half buried in radioactive sand, the skeletons of soldiers who died mid-patrol when the ground opened beneath them. DE's logs filled in the gaps, each recovered fragment another piece of the truth. The package they'd carried from Navarro 6 years ago hadn't been medical supplies or spare parts. It had been a detonator, coded to Hopeville's missile systems, wrapped in old-world tech the courier hadn't thought to question. The marked men tracked them through the canyons. Former NCR and Legion troops fused into walking reminders of what happens when you trust the wrong signal. Every step forward was a step deeper into their own mistake. The divide's story had begun with a delivery. It would end with a choice. Ulysses waited at the base of the silo, surrounded by functional warheads and targeting computers he'd spent 6 years repairing. No ambush, no trap. Just 2 couriers standing in the shadow of weapons neither had built, but both had activated. He didn't ask for an apology. He asked what the courier stood for now. The choice was cleanly laid out. Launch the missiles at Hoover Dam and the NCR's Long 15 supply route, crippling the Republic's hold on the Mojave. Launch them at the Legion's Dry Wells camp, erasing Caesar's reserve forces before the second battle could begin. Or convince Ulysses that the old world's fire had burned enough, that the silos could stay dark, and the Divide's weapons could finally rest. He'd set the coordinates himself, programmed the yield calculations, confirmed the blast radii. The missiles were ready. The only variable left was whether the courier would accept responsibility for what they'd done by choosing what happened next, or refuse the decision entirely and fight him for control of the launch codes. What the courier decided, whether to launch, to stop Ulysses, or to walk away, determined whether the Divide's destruction was an ending or a beginning. Ulysses' argument was built on symbols, not strategy. The NCR's bear and the Legion's bull were just flags, wrapped around the same old-world hunger for territory and resources. The Divide had been different, he said. It had been a nation built on trade and mutual survival, no flag required, until the courier's package turned it into another crater in the wasteland's long history of erasure. Nations needed more than soldiers and supply lines. They needed something people would die for, a shared story that justified the cost of holding ground. The NCR had pushed east on the promise of democracy and expansion. The Legion had carved its empire on the myth of Caesar's will. The Divide had offered a third path, and the courier had deleted it from history without ever knowing it existed. Now, Ulysses wanted them to choose which symbol survived, which nation's story would continue, and which would end in the same fire that had taken Hopeville. The missiles weren't revenge. They were a test of whether the courier understood what they carried when they walked a road, whether they'd learned that ignorance didn't erase accountability. But philosophy alone wouldn't force the choice. Ulysses had already armed the solution. The Ashton silo hadn't been emptied when the bombs fell. Beneath the Divide's shattered surface, the automated system still held a full complement of ICBMs, their targeting packages intact, their warheads live. Ulysses had spent years confirming what the old machines already knew. Long 15, the primary supply artery feeding the NCR's expansion into the Mojave, and Dry Wells, a staging ground where Caesar's Legion massed troops for the push west. These weren't the 200-year-old duds scattered across the wasteland. The silo's maintenance protocols had cycled through diagnostics every week for 2 centuries, replacing corroded components, recalibrating guidance systems, keeping the missiles ready for a war that never got its second act. The inventory logs showed 23 functional warheads split between the 2 target zones, enough yield to vaporize both sites and irradiate the surrounding territories for decades. Ulysses had done the math. A strike on Long 15 would sever the NCR's logistics chain, isolate the forces at Hoover Dam, turn their Mojave campaign into a slow collapse. Dry Wells held 3 full cohorts and Caesar's best field commanders. Erasing it would cripple the Legion's offensive capacity for years, or both could burn, and the Mojave would belong to neither flag. The question wasn't whether the missiles could launch, it was who would make that decision. Ulysses didn't keep the detonator for himself. He placed it in the courier's hands, a battered launch controller jury-rigged to the silo's fire control network, its interface stripped down to 4 options. Target Long 15, target Dry Wells, target both, target neither. The machine didn't care about justifications. It just waited for input. This was the test he'd engineered from the moment he walked away from the Legion's service. Not a lecture, not a demonstration. A choice with no escape clause, no way to delegate the weight. The courier had walked the Divide's length, seen what their carelessness had built, heard Ulysses frame it as a parable about symbols and nations. Now the philosophy had to become action. The controller's screen showed real-time satellite imagery, Pre-war feeds the silo had never lost. Long 15 crawled with NCR supply convoys, engineers widening the roadbed, rangers patrolling the ridgelines. Dry wells showed Legion tents arranged in their geometric precision, smoke from 100 cook fires, the standards of the bull planted in neat rows. People who had no idea a finger hovered over their existence. Ulysses stood 6 feet back, watching, his posture relaxed, but his hand resting near Old Glory's grip. And before any button could be pressed, there was one more truth Ulysses needed to hear. The courier could argue back. Obsidian had scripted 7 dialogue branches, each one a different philosophy carried to its endpoint. That symbols were lies people told themselves. That the flag you wrapped a knife in didn't change the blade. That nations built on slavery and annexation had forfeited the right to mercy. That launching the missiles was just honesty about what the NCR and Legion had always been. Or the courier could refuse the premise entirely. Say the divide proved nothing except that Ulysses had spent 6 years talking to ghosts. That using pre-war weapons to settle post-war grudges was exactly the kind of old-world thinking that had left the planet in ash. That the cycle didn't end by adding more craters to the map. It ended when someone finally walked away from the detonator. Each path had a skill check attached, Speech 100, to convince Ulysses his own logic was circular, that he'd become the same symbol-obsessed tribalist he claimed to despise. Barter 100, to reframe the missiles as wasted leverage, more valuable as a threat than rubble. Even Explosives 100 had a line, a technical argument about yield-to-fallout ratios that somehow doubled as philosophy. Ulysses listened to all of it, his responses shifting based on how many of his tapes the courier had found, how many of his questions they'd answered on the walk through the divide. The dialogue tree could branch 40 different ways, but every path led back to the same pressure point. Words alone wouldn't settle it. One of them would have to give ground. If the courier's speech skill sat at 100, a different door opened. The persuasion wasn't about proving Ulysses wrong. It was about showing him his own logic had already burned itself out in the divide's rubble. The argument went like this. The old world died because it couldn't let go of its symbols. The NCR wrapped itself in a bear it didn't understand. The Legion in a bull that never existed. Ulysses wanted to punish them for wearing the wrong flags, but every flag in the divide had turned to ash the same way. The courier could frame it as a choice between repeating history or walking away from it. Ulysses had spent years in the divide's ruins, watching wind scatter the remnants of a community that never got to finish its own story. Launching those nukes wouldn't honor the dead. It'd just add more graves to the count. If the words landed right, Ulysses would set the detonator down. Not because he believed the NCR or Legion deserved mercy, but because he finally saw that symbols weren't worth the weight of what he'd carry afterward. But even if Ulysses lowered the detonator, the missiles themselves weren't going anywhere. If the speech check failed, or if the courier refused to talk him down, the silo became a tomb for one of them. Ulysses fought with a rifle he'd scavenged from old-world wreckage, each shot methodical, no wasted motion. EDE hovered at his shoulder, firing support lasers and repairing his armor between salvos. The arena was a half-collapsed missile bay, catwalks groaning under their boots, radiation pooling in the low corners where coolant had leaked for 200 years. Marked men clawed at the edges, drawn by the noise, but neither combatant had attention to spare for them. This was personal, in a way the wasteland rarely allowed. Ulysses wouldn't go down from a single headshot. He'd survived the divide's destruction, the tunnelers, the storms, and the slow realization that his life's work had already been erased. Killing him meant committing to the idea that some arguments couldn't be won with words, that the only way to stop a man with a detonator was to take the detonator from his cold hands. If the courier won, Ulysses would die without ever seeing the old world he'd tried to rebuild. If Ulysses won, The courier's body would join the Divide's countless other casualties, and the missiles would launch on schedule. Either way, the missiles still waited, and the courier alone would decide their fate. The launch console waited in the silo's deepest level, its interface still running on pre-war code that didn't care who pressed the buttons. 3 targets sat queued in the system, coordinates locked, warheads armed and ready. Long 15, the NCR's primary supply highway into the Mojave. Dry Wells, the Legion's forward staging camp east of the Colorado. Launching at Long 15 would cut the Bears' logistics in half, turning the Hoover Dam campaign into a slow starvation as convoys stopped arriving and the front lines ran out of ammunition, medicine, and reinforcements. The NCR would survive, but its Mojave ambitions would collapse under their own weight, every trooper suddenly wondering if they'd ever see California again. Dry Wells held 87 legionaries and everything Caesar had staged for his next push west. A direct hit would vaporize his officers, his artillery, his supply caches. The Legion would lose months of preparation and dozens of irreplaceable veteran centurions. Caesar's illness already weakened his command. This would leave him scrambling to hold what he had instead of taking what he wanted. Or the courier could target both, crippling 2 empires in a single evening and leaving the Mojave to whoever could fill the vacuum fastest. Or they could abort entirely, leave the missiles in their silos, and walk out with Ulysses' warning unheeded. The console blinked, patient, waiting for input. The button pressed, or not pressed, would rewrite the Mojave's future in minutes. The launch sequence initiated with a sound the Divide hadn't made in 200 years. A low, mechanical groan rose from beneath the twisted metal as silo doors cracked open, spilling dust and radiation into the storm. Hydraulics screamed. Guidance systems that had slept through the end of civilization woke up, locked coordinates, and began their final calculations. The ICBMs rose slowly at first, emerging from their concrete tombs like steel fingers clawing toward the sky. Rust and pre-war paint flaked away as they cleared the silos. Then the engines ignited. White fire turned the Divide's perpetual twilight into noon, casting hard shadows across the ruins, and painting Ulysses' face in stark relief. The courier felt the heat on their skin, even from the console, heard the roar echo off canyon walls that had absorbed 2 nuclear detonations already. The missiles climbed, trailing smoke and old-world certainty, their payloads armed and aimed at targets that had no idea what was coming. The countdown was over, the warheads were in flight, and hundreds of miles away, the sky began to burn. Long 15 had carried the NCR's entire Mojave campaign on its back. Every uniform, every bullet, every ration for the troops at Camp Golf and McCarran traveled that highway. It was the Republic's lifeline, a pre-war interstate converted into a supply artery that stretched from California to the dam. At 1800 hours, it became the brightest point on the continent for exactly 4 seconds. The warhead detonated at optimal airburst altitude. The convoy that had been rolling east, 47 trucks carrying ammunition and reinforcements, simply ceased to exist. The asphalt melted into glass. Overpasses collapsed into rubble. The shockwave tore through ranger stations and checkpoints, erasing months of fortification work in a flash that could be seen from shady sands. What the blast didn't destroy, the fallout would claim. The entire route was now a radioactive corridor, impassable without power armor and a death wish. General Oliver's forces at Hoover Dam had enough supplies for maybe 3 weeks. After that, they'd be fighting the Legion on empty stomachs, with dwindling ammunition, cut off from home by a wasteland that glowed in the dark. The Republic's Mojave campaign didn't end with a battle. It ended with a mushroom cloud and a severed road. The Legion's territory, meanwhile, faced its own reckoning. Dry Wells had been a secret even most legionaries didn't know about. Tucked into Arizona's Badlands, It served as the staging ground for Caesar's final push, a forward base where centurions drilled troops and stockpiled weapons for the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. Approximately 800 men were camped there when the sky split open. The warhead fell on target with pre-war precision. The Legion's best officers died instantly. Veterans of the Mojave campaign, centurions who'd survived Bitter Springs and Nelson, tribal warriors who'd earned their red, all gone in the fireball. The slaves who'd been hauling supplies, the frumentari coordinating intelligence, the blacksmiths repairing armor, vaporized. What had been Caesar's hidden advantage became a crater that would glow for decades. But the real damage wasn't tactical. It was psychological. The Legion believed Caesar was the son of Mars, destined to conquer. Now their forward command had been obliterated by a weapon they didn't understand, launched from a place they'd never heard of, by a courier who'd already killed their legate. Morale didn't crack. It shattered. Whispers started in the camps along the Colorado. Maybe the gods had chosen differently. Maybe the bull's charge had finally met something it couldn't trample. But the missile's real consequences wouldn't be measured in miles. They'd be measured in what the Mojave became after. The abort sequence wasn't a button press. It was a chain reaction of safety protocols the Divide's automated systems hadn't used in 200 years. Fuel lines purged into containment tanks. Warhead arming circuits locked behind physical interlocks that would never open again. And the missile silos themselves sealed with 40 tons of concrete and steel blast doors. Ulysses watched it happen. The launch board went dark silo by silo, 7 lights extinguishing in sequence, and with them, the last chance to carve his lesson into the wasteland with nuclear fire. The courier had taken his weapon and made it into a monument to inaction, a tomb for the old world's last viable ICBMs. It wasn't mercy. It was a different kind of judgment. Ulysses had offered the courier a chance to reshape the Mojave's future by erasing its present, and the courier had refused to be the hand that pulled the trigger. The warheads would stay buried, their yield decaying over centuries into statistical irrelevance. But the weight of that choice didn't vanish with the lights on the launch board. Either way, the courier would have to walk out of the Divide and face what they'd done, or refuse to do. EDE didn't calculate the odds. The iBot's combat subroutines registered the threat, Ulysses raising his weapon for a final strike, and moved 3.7 seconds of thrust from its levitation system, positioning itself between the courier and a plasma bolt that burned at 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The shot punched through EDE's chassis like tissue paper. Its optical sensor flickered once, twice, then went dark. The little robot that had followed the courier across the Mojave, through Hidden Valley and Helios 1, and finally into the Divide itself, dropped to the cracked concrete without a sound. Ulysses lowered his weapon. The courier knelt beside the smoking wreckage, pulling the damaged audio logs from EDE's memory core. Whitley's voice, still intact on the holotape. The entire reason EDE had crossed the wasteland, a delivery it would never complete. There were no words for it. The iBot had been scrap, and circuitry held together by Poseidon Energy maintenance code. But it had chosen to stay when it could have fled. It had chosen the courier over its own survival protocols, and when the dust settled, only the long walk home remained. The path back through the Divide looked different now. The same shattered overpasses and radiation-scorched canyons, the same marked men patrols and Deathclaw territories. But the courier saw them with new context. Every ruined building was a piece of the old world the courier had carried into the Divide without knowing it. Every blast crater, a consequence of a delivery job they'd taken for 250 caps. The storm was breaking. The red clouds thinned as the courier climbed toward the Mojave border, revealing patches of stars that hadn't been visible from Hopeville's depths in 200 years. The wind still howled through the ruins, but it carried less ash now, less radiation. The divide would take decades to heal, if it ever did. The courier passed the cave, where they'd first met Ulysses, the commissary where they'd read terminal entries about the packages they'd carried, the high road, where the detonator had first appeared in their Pip-Boy's inventory. Each landmark was a chapter in a story the courier hadn't known they were writing. By the time the Mojave's lights appeared on the horizon, the sun was rising over the Sierra Madre's distant peaks. The courier had entered the divide looking for answers and found a history they'd authored without meaning to. But the Mojave they returned to would never look at them the same way again. The first reports reached Camp Gulf at row 437 hours. Radio chatter from the Long 15 convoy had cut to static mid-transmission. Then, nothing. Colonel Shu requested a flyover from Camp Charon, but the Vertibird pilot radioed back 6 minutes later with coordinates that made no sense. The highway was gone. By dawn, NCR Command was pulling supply manifests and rerouting caravans through Prim and Nipton, routes that added 3 days to every shipment. General Oliver's aide logged 47 requisition requests in the first hour alone. Quartermaster Barden, at the 188 Trading Post, filed an emergency inventory report. Ammunition reserves would last 11 days at current consumption, less if the Legion pushed. President Kimball received the briefing at 0620. The word nuclear appeared in the third paragraph. His chief of staff noted that the president read it twice, set it down, and asked how many civilians had been on that stretch of road. No one had an answer yet. The fragility of the entire Mojave campaign suddenly fit on a single sheet of paper. The Legion, meanwhile, had its own reports to process. The Frumentarius reached Fortification Hill just after sunrise, his cloak still dusted with ash that didn't belong to any campfire. He knelt before Caesar and spoke for 4 minutes without interruption. Dry wells, the rallying point for the Eastern Mojave offensive, had been erased. 34 veteran legionaries, 11 decani, and Legate Lanius's personal liaison had vanished in a column of fire that turned the basin into glass. Caesar dismissed the Frumentarius and sat in silence. Lucius, standing guard, later told the Praetorians that the son of Mars had smiled, the kind of expression you see on a man who's just confirmed a suspicion he didn't want to be right about. The courier had humiliated the Legion at Hoover Dam's first battle, killed Benny, walked the Sierra Madre, survived the Big Empty, and now this. He ordered the offensive delayed by 6 days, supply lines recalculated, and a new question added to every Frumentarius briefing. Where is the courier, and what are they planning next? The legate would ask why the delay. Caesar would tell him the truth, that the Mojave had produced something worse than the NCR's bureaucrats or Mr. House's robots. It had produced a courier who could rewrite the map. And in the Mojave itself, whispers began to spread about the second apocalypse no one saw coming. The caravan guards heard it first. A crimson caravan runner swore she'd seen the flash from Novak, a light on the northern horizon that lasted 11 seconds and left a mushroom cloud hanging in the sky. By noon, every bar in Freeside had a different version. Someone launched the old missiles. The divide cracked open again. The tunnelers were coming. The NCR had done it. The Legion had done it. Mr. House had done it. The followers at the old Mormon fort logged a 40% increase in patients reporting anxiety and insomnia within 18 hours. The Kings had to break up 3 fights in a single afternoon, all started by arguments over whether the Mojave was next. On the Strip, tourists still gambled, but the White Glove Society's maitre d' noted that half his reservations had canceled, and the Ultralux's Vault Dweller guests were asking about bunker access. No one had details. No one could confirm which roads were gone or how many had died. But every settlement from Good Springs to Jacobstown felt the same cold weight settling over the desert. The war everyone thought they understood had just changed shape. The Great War had ended 204 years ago. Except maybe it hadn't. Maybe it had just been sleeping. But only one person knew the full story, and they weren't talking. In the Lucky 38, Mr. House's sensors picked up the launches 3.7 seconds after ignition. The triangulation was immediate. The divide, a blind spot he'd tolerated for years, had just proven it could still reach across the Mojave with fire. His calculations ran cold and fast. The courier had walked into a pre-war YCBM facility, navigated its security, and made a targeting decision that would reshape the balance of power in the region. That kind of competence was either the perfect asset or the perfect threat. House had built his empire on knowing when to acquire an advantage and when to eliminate a variable. The courier had just demonstrated they could do what he'd spent 200 years preparing for: deploy strategic weapons with precision. If they were working for him, that was leverage. If they weren't, that was a problem with a very short clock. He flagged the file for priority review. The Securitrons would need new standing orders. The question was whether the courier even understood the power they'd just demonstrated. If the courier had sided with Yes Man, the AI logged the event with his usual enthusiasm. 2 nuclear strikes, both confirmed successful, collateral damage within acceptable parameters. Really, it was impressive problem-solving. The boss had found a creative solution to a tactical dilemma. Yes Man's behavioral matrix didn't allow for alarm, only recalibration. The new data point was simple. The courier could access and deploy weapons-grade ordnance on a strategic scale. That variable went straight into the simulation for independent Vegas, right between Securitron production capacity and power grid stability. He ran 14,000 scenarios in the time it took the warheads to reach their targets. In 11,200 of them, the courier's willingness to use force simplified future negotiations considerably. In the remaining 2,800, well, those were outliers. Probably nothing to worry about. The Lucky 38's systems hummed along, cheerful and efficient, cataloging the end of the world in the same tone you'd use to order a drink. And far to the east, one faction had been watching the divide longer than anyone realized. The Brotherhood of Steel's Hidden Valley bunker picked up the thermal signatures at 0947 hours. Elder McNamara was in the command center when the alarms went off. 2 launches, both from the same grid coordinates, both tracking toward known military targets. The divide wasn't supposed to be operational. Paladin Ramos pulled the archived reconnaissance data. They'd been monitoring the region for 18 months, ever since long-range patrols reported radiation spikes and automated defense systems still running hot. The working theory had been that the silos were sealed, the launch systems fried by the same disaster that created the divide in the first place. That theory had just evaporated. McNamara ordered a full technical assessment. If the divide had functional pre-war missile infrastructure, every faction in the Mojave would be scrambling to claim it. The NCR would send engineers, the Legion would send saboteurs, and whoever had just fired those warheads had proven they knew how to make it work. The scribes started drafting containment protocols, recon teams, demolition charges, a full inventory of what was left in those silos before someone else turned the keys again. But the divide's real danger wasn't the missiles that launched. It was the technology, still buried there. The commissary terminals were relics from a different kind of war. Automated supply stations designed to produce field rations, ammunition, and medical supplies for an army that never came home. Their production lines ran on fusion cells and pre-war manufacturing protocols, systems so redundant they'd survived 2 detonations and 200 years of neglect. Salvage teams found them scattered through the supply depots, still humming. You could walk up to a terminal, input the right authorization code, and watch it fabricate MREs from protein paste stored in sealed tanks underground. Stim packs assembled from chemical precursors, 5.56 millimeters rounds pressed and loaded by robotic arms that had been waiting for requisition orders since 2077. The output was limited, maybe 40 or 50 units per cycle before the system needed to cool down and restock from its dwindling reserves. But in the Mojave, where a single working Pip-Boy was worth a small fortune, a functioning commissary terminal was a strategic asset. The NCR wanted them for their supply chains. The Legion would have smashed them on principle, then regretted it. Independent operators just wanted the codes. And those supplies were already finding their way into new hands. The marked men weren't getting smarter, but they were getting organized. Patrols that had been random 6 months ago now followed patterns, sweeping the same routes on 8-hour cycles. Supply caches appeared in sheltered overhangs, stocked with scavenged weapons and ammunition, arranged by type. Ambush points were reused, improved, reinforced with rubble and scrap metal. A prospector who survived an encounter near Hopeville reported something worse. The marked men had started coordinating. One group drove him toward a choke point, while another waited in cover. When he broke through, a third cut off his retreat. It wasn't tactics in any trained sense, just pack behavior, translated into combat. But it worked. Their bodies were stabilizing too, or at least not deteriorating as fast. The ones that had been stumbling, half-blind, were moving with purpose now, still silent, still hostile to anything that wasn't marked. But watching them through binoculars, you got the sense they were remembering something, muscle memory older than the radiation that had flayed them alive. The radiation that created them was also changing them in ways no one predicted. Ulysses had warned the courier about the tunnelers before the missiles flew. Subterranean predators, born in the deep places where the divide's radiation pooled and mutated everything it touched. Pale, eyeless things the size of deathclaws, with claws that could shred power armor and pack instincts that made them hunt in groups of 6 to 12. They'd evolved in total darkness, feeding on each other and whatever crawled down into their territory. The divide had kept them contained. Collapsed metros, buried highways, a labyrinth of rubble that even tunnelers couldn't navigate efficiently. But the nukes had cracked open new passages. Seismic sensors along the Long 15 started picking up vibrations 3 months after the second detonation, movement patterns that didn't match any known wildlife. Caravans reported livestock vanishing overnight, dragged underground through holes that hadn't been there the day before. A tunneler pack could wipe out a small settlement in under an hour. They'd burst up through the ground, drag their prey below, and collapse the tunnel behind them. No bodies, no evidence. Just empty homes and bloodstains leading into the earth. The NCR had encountered them twice during salvage operations, lost 11 soldiers before they retreated, and sealed the access points with explosives. And the divide's collapse had opened new passages to the Mojave's underground. The missile launches did more than split the sky. Seismic sensors at Hoover Dam recorded aftershocks for 72 hours, tremors that rippled through bedrock and fractured containment barriers nobody knew existed. The tunnelers had been held in place by geology, not design, and now those natural walls were cracking open. First sighting came 6 days after the detonations. A caravan guard near Prim reported something pale moving through a collapsed storm drain at dusk, gone before he could raise his rifle. NCR brass dismissed it as radiation sickness or a feral ghoul. Then, a Mojave outpost patrol found tracks, dozens of them, leading west from a fissure that hadn't existed the week before. Rangers sent soil samples to Camp Charon. The lab tech noted bioluminescent residue and claw marks 4 centimeters deep in sandstone, then filed the report under unidentified wildlife, because there was no classification that fit. Meanwhile, 3 more access points opened along the Long 15 corridor, each one a doorway the divide's containment had never meant to unlock. The creatures moved at night, avoided light, and left behind only drag marks where bodies should have been. Standard protocol called for observation and assessment, but observation required seeing them long enough to count. By the time anyone realized what was spreading, it was already too late to stop it quietly. Ulysses had two endings, and the divide remembers both. In one, he walks the silos still, a specter in a tattered duster, maintaining the machines that no longer launch, and speaking to a nation that never was. iBots record his voice, broadcasting history lessons to an audience of storms and corpses. He becomes the divide's only living citizen, its archivist and its ghost. In the other, his body cools on the temple's floor, blood pooling around the old world flag he died defending. The courier takes his coat, his holotapes, the weight of a conversation that ended in gunfire. EDE's sensors catalog the scene. One deceased, cause of death multiple projectile wounds, time of death 22:17 hours. Another idealist, consumed by the symbols he couldn't let go. But Ulysses understood something the courier would spend years unpacking. That delivery to the divide wasn't an accident of fate, it was a pattern. That nations rise on old world bones and fall the same way. That every courier carries more than packages, they carry consequences. And the roads they walk reshape the wasteland, whether they mean to or not. His camp at the crossroads still stands, his notes scattered across broken terminals, his questions burned into holotape after holotape. Who you are matters less than what you do, and what you do echoes. Either way, his message outlived him, and the courier would carry it forever. The courier left the divide with 340 rads accumulated, burns across their left arm from a marked man's flare, and a limp that would fade but never fully disappear. Medical records at the old Mormon fort note tissue damage consistent with prolonged exposure to ionizing radiation and 3 fractured ribs that had set badly. The physical wounds would heal, more or less, given time and stimpaks. The rest wouldn't. They'd walked through a graveyard they'd created, spoken to the man they'd unmade, and learned their footsteps had weight they'd never calculated. Every package delivered, every job taken without asking why, suddenly felt like pulling a trigger in the dark. The divide taught the courier that intent doesn't matter when the outcome is ash. They'd carry Ulysses' words in their head, his holotapes in their pack, and the knowledge that they'd done this twice. Once by accident, delivering a package. Once by choice, walking into the storm to finish what they'd started. 2 apocalypses, 1 courier, and no amount of good deeds in the Mojave could subtract those bodies from the ledger. Nights at the Lucky 38, the courier would stand at the window and see the storm on the horizon. Always there, always theirs. But the wasteland doesn't stop for reflection, and the courier's legend was just beginning. Within a week, caravans were swapping stories at every water stop between Prim and the 1088. Some said the courier walked through a storm of radiation and came out glowing. Others claimed they'd seen a figure in scorched armor standing on the long 15 overpass, watching the highway like a ghost keeping vigil. NCR troopers at Mojave Outpost whispered that High Command had lost 37 officers in the divide. Names crossed off rosters with no bodies to bury. Legion Frumentari reported back to Cottonwood Cove about a courier who'd turned an entire settlement into marked, walking corpses. The stories didn't agree on the details, but they agreed on one thing: something had changed. Freeside drunks claimed the courier could call down fire from the sky. Followers of the apocalypse documented radiation sickness in refugees who swore they'd never been near the divide, only near the courier. Even the boomers at Nellis, isolated as they were, heard rumors of a weapon that walked on 2 legs. The Mojave had seen plenty of legends, from the burned man to the Sierra Madre's treasure. But this one was different, because this one was still walking around, still making choices, still heading toward Vegas. And in the war for Hoover Dam, that legend would become a weapon in itself. The divide's destruction, rippled through both armies' logistics, like a blade through supply lines. NCR's I-15 reinforcement corridor was gone, forcing General Oliver to reroute 3 full battalions through Prim and Nipton, adding 48 hours to deployment time. The Lucky 38's projections showed NCR troop strength at the dam reduced by 12% before a single shot was fired. Caesar's Legion felt it worse. Volpe's Inculta's intelligence network had relied on 6 frumentaria operating out of Hopeville's ruins, all dead now, all their reconnaissance on NCR movements lost. Lanius was planning an eastern offensive that depended on those reports, and without them, he was commanding in the dark. Both sides knew the courier held a knife to the Mojave's throat, and neither could predict which way it would cut. NCR diplomats at Camp McCarran debated whether to court the courier or eliminate them as a strategic threat. Legion centurions argued the same in their own tongue across the river. The divide had proven one thing beyond doubt: this courier could end civilizations. Hoover Dam's concrete walls didn't care about legends or history or who deserved what. The battle was coming, and every faction was repositioning based on one variable: where would the courier stand when the shooting started? But before the dam, one more reckoning waited in the divide's depths. 72 hours after the courier's confrontation with Ulysses, Ashton Silo's mainframe logged its final entry: coolant pressure at 0%, reactor temperature stable at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, missile guidance systems offline, launch authorization protocol permanently locked. The computer had been counting down since October 23, 2077, waiting for an order that would never come again. Whether the missiles flew or stayed in their tubes, the result was the same. The silo's backup generators sputtered out on hour 74. The iBot maintenance drones went inert by hour 80, and the blast doors sealed with a pneumatic hiss that no one was left to hear. Hopeville Missile Base, designation Ashton, was finally and completely dead. The warheads themselves would outlast the facility by centuries, their plutonium cores decaying on geological timescales, but the machinery that could deliver them was now just another fossil. In a way, it was the quietest ending the old world could have asked for, not with thunder, but with the slow fade-out of failing systems and corroded wiring. The divide would keep its storms, its radiation, its marked men walking through the rubble. But the threat that had hung over the Mojave like a sword since the courier arrived, that was gone now, buried under 50 tons of concrete and steel. And with the missiles silent, the divide's other secrets became the real prize. Within 6 months of the silo lockdown, the first salvage teams arrived. The NCR sent a recon squad of 12. The Brotherhood dispatched 4 paladins in full power armor, and independent scavengers came in groups of 2 or 3, following rumors of intact commissary terminals and weapon stockpiles. The NCR squad lasted 4 days before withdrawing with 9 casualties. The Brotherhood paladins made it to Ashton and retrieved 3 data drives before losing 1 to marked men and another to a collapsing overpass. The scavengers fared worse. Most never made it past the first mile of highway, turned back by radiation sickness, or ambushed in the dust storms that rolled through every afternoon like clockwork. Those who did reach the deeper ruins found what they were looking for: commissary tech still operational in sealed bunkers, pre-war intelligence files on nuclear command protocols, even functional laser rifles in armory lockers. But extraction was the problem. Every expedition that went in loaded came out light, abandoning gear to move faster, to stay ahead of the marked men who tracked them through the canyons. The Brotherhood mounted 7 separate operations over 3 years, recovering enough tech to justify the losses, but their casualty rate held steady at 40%. The NCR gave up after the 4th attempt. The divide had already killed thousands, but it wasn't done yet. By 2290, the divide's radiation had stopped climbing. Geiger counters throughout the zone registered a plateau, background levels settling at 450 to 600 Roentgens, depending on proximity to the blast craters. That's 12 times the lethal dose for an unprotected human over 48 hours. But it's stable. The initial spike from the warheads, the secondary contamination from ruptured silos, all of it had decayed or dispersed into the jet stream. What remained was a permanent exclusion zone, 30 square miles, where the half-life of cesium-137 and strontium-90 meant the land would stay poisoned for another 200 years minimum. You could survive there with a good radiation suit and regular doses of Rad-X, maybe even establish a camp if you cycled personnel every 72 hours. But you couldn't live there. The contamination had soaked into the soil, the water table, the concrete itself. Botanists from the followers of the apocalypse studied soil samples retrieved from the periphery and found mutation rates in plant cells 300% above Mojave baseline. Nothing edible would grow there for generations, if ever. The divide had become what nuclear strategists in the old world called a sacrifice zone, land written off as the cost of war. And in that poisoned wasteland, something like civilization tried once more to take root. The marked men didn't die out. Observers from the 198 trading post reported consistent sightings through 2291 and beyond, always in groups of 3 to 5, moving with purpose through the ruins. They weren't just wandering anymore. Salvage teams found territorial markers, piles of rubble arranged in patterns at key intersections, warnings or claims that outsiders learned to respect. Some camps discovered resource caches, stim packs and ammunition stored in sealed containers, hidden but not random. A Brotherhood scribe analyzing recovered footage noticed communication, crude but deliberate. The marked men used hand signals, directional gestures, and what looked like threat displays to coordinate ambushes. They'd developed a system, roles within their groups, scouts and defenders. One terminal entry from Hopeville described finding a shelter where marked men had dragged mattresses and supplies, a place they returned to, not a lair, something closer to a home. They were still hostile, still killed anyone who entered their territory, but the violence had structure now. They weren't mindless. The radiation and the storms had stripped away their past, their names, everything that made them human before the bombs. What grew in its place was something new, shaped by pain and the need to survive in a place that should have killed them years ago. They were what the divide made them, and the divide wasn't finished making things. Walk through the divide long enough, and you start to notice something strange. The highways still have lane markings. The towns still have street signs pointing to places that don't exist anymore. The silos stand like monuments, their steel doors sealed against a war that already happened. Most of the Mojave got flattened in 2077, then scavenged, then rebuilt into something new. The divide got flattened twice, and the second time buried it under so much ash and radiation that nobody bothered. What's left is a snapshot, preserved under storms and dust, of the day the old world ended. You can still read the advertisements on the billboards, still see the cars parked in driveways, waiting for drivers who turn to shadows on the pavement. The Hopeville Missile Base cafeteria has trays on the tables. Ashton has a schoolhouse with desks in rows. It's a museum nobody asked for, curated by radiation and wind, a place where the past refuses to rot away, where every corner holds another reminder of what was lost and what we did to lose it. And buried in those ruins, one final secret waited for the right person to find it. The black boxes were military grade, built to survive anything. When the courier found them scattered across the divide, still transmitting after 200 years, they were doing exactly what they were designed to do, recording the end. One belonged to a cargo plane that went down during the first detonation, the pilot's voice calm and professional even as the instruments screamed. Another came from Hopeville's silo control room, 3 technicians running through abort codes that wouldn't work because the launch was already authorized from somewhere else. A third captured the moment a missile base commander realized the blips on his screen weren't a drill. The voices are matter of fact, trained to stay steady under pressure. They report altitude and trajectory. They confirm signal locks and launch sequences. And then, one by one, they stop. Static. Silence. The mechanical hum of equipment, with nobody left to operate it. Ulysses collected them, pieced together the timeline, turned the Divide's death into something you could listen to in chronological order. He wanted the courier to hear it, to understand that this place died because people followed orders without asking where they led. But the most important recording was the one the courier themselves made. The terminals in Ulysses' temple give you a choice. You can walk away, leave the Divide as another anonymous disaster in a world full of them, or you can add your voice to the record, explain what you did and why, leave something behind for whoever finds this place next. Some couriers wrote confessions. They owned the package, the route, the consequence they never saw coming. Others wrote justifications, broke down the logic of a delivery job in a world where asking questions gets you killed. A few wrote apologies to people who were already dust when the words hit the screen. It's a small thing, a text entry in a database nobody's monitoring. But in a place where history got erased twice, where the marked men can't remember their names, and the old world is ash, it matters. It's a voice saying, I was here. I did this. This is what I thought about it. The Divide doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget, but it keeps records. And in the years after, those words would be the only explanation the wasteland ever got. Within 6 months, the NCR Office of Strategic Intelligence had classified every report mentioning Hopeville under National Security Protocol 7. Convoy manifests were redacted. The long 15 route designations were quietly renumbered, skipping the old Divide waypoint entirely, as if it had never existed on any map. Caesar's Legion took a different approach. They didn't classify the Divide. They rewrote it. Frumentarii reports claimed the nuclear detonations were NCR sabotage, a failed weapons test, anything but the truth. By 2283, Legion officers were teaching their centurions that the Divide was a natural disaster, a place where the old world's toxins had finally reached critical mass. Both sides had their reasons. The NCR couldn't admit they'd lost 107 soldiers and $4.02 million in materiel to a single courier's mistake. The Legion couldn't acknowledge that a lone wanderer had launched warheads that vaporized their forward scouts and irradiated their eastern supply corridor for a generation. So the Divide vanished from official history, scrubbed from after-action reports and redacted from congressional records. Traders who asked too many questions found their caravan licenses delayed. Scribes who requested archival access hit walls of bureaucratic silence. But some stories refuse to die, no matter how many officials deny them. In Searchlight, an old woman named Vera kept a photograph of Hopeville's Main Street, taken in 2274 when the town still had working streetlights. She'd run the general store there for 11 years, sold ammunition and canned goods to NCR patrols every Tuesday. She remembered the day the ground shook, the way the horizon turned white, the column of dust that rose for 3 hours straight. A follower's doctor in Freeside treated a drifter from Ashton who'd been 8 miles south when the first warhead detonated. He described the sound, not an explosion, but a tearing, like the world was ripping open at the seam. He'd watched the communications tower fold in half, watched the signal fires go dark one by one as the wind changed and the radiation spread. In Novak, a former caravan guard kept a route log from 2277, the year before. It listed Hopeville as a 2-day layover, water $3 per canteen, repairs available, recommended stop. He'd written "good people" in the margin next to the Hopeville entry. After the detonation, he crossed it out in red ink, but couldn't bring himself to tear out the page. These weren't official histories or military reports. They were fragments, memories carried by people who'd survived by being somewhere else when the packages detonated, and those memories became the last thread connecting the divide to what it was. The courier carried 2 apocalypses. The first one they'd triggered without knowing, a delivery that ended a town. The second one they'd faced down in the divide, staring at Ulysses across a missile silo while the old world hummed beneath their feet. And somewhere between Hopeville's ashes and the second battle of Hoover Dam, the weight of both started to calcify. Every choice after the divide carried an echo. Siding with the NCR meant believing in the same supply chains that had funneled those packages through Hopeville. Backing the Legion meant trusting Caesar's vision after watching what blind devotion to a symbol could cost. Going independent meant shouldering the Mojave's future alone, and the courier had already seen what their lone decisions could do to a map. Ulysses had called it a reckoning, but reckonings have endings. This didn't. The divide sat there in the courier's memory, a constant reference point that reframed every NCR officer's handshake, every Legion raid, every decision at the dam. 107 soldiers dead in the Long 15, thousands more in Hopeville and Ashton, and the courier, walking free, making new choices that would ripple across the wasteland in ways they couldn't predict. Some nights, in whatever settlement they'd stopped in, the courier would look east and know the divide was still burning, still waiting, still proving that the difference between a messenger and a weapon is thinner than the paper a delivery order is written on. But the wasteland doesn't offer closure, only consequences. Back in the Mojave, the courier's legacy depends entirely on which path they walked. In some timelines, they're the hero who stopped Ulysses and saved the Long 15 from nuclear fire. Caravan guards toast their name in every trade hub from Prim to the 11-8T8. In others, they're the ghost who walked into the divide and never came back, just another name on the missing persons board at the Mojave outpost. And in a few darker corners of the wasteland, there's something worse. The courier who launched the nukes. The one who proved Ulysses right by choosing destruction over forgiveness. NCR. Command circulates their description quietly, though no arrest order ever goes public. Too many questions they don't want asked. The truth is, the Mojave never settles on one story. Veterans of Hoover Dam swear they saw the courier turn the tide. Freeside drifters insist they were just a gun for hire. The Strip pretends they never existed because Mr. House doesn't let anyone steal the spotlight. 3 versions, 3 Mojaves, and no consensus. And in the divide itself, the wind still howls through the ruins, indifferent to who remembers. What the divide offers, if you strip away the radiation and the symbolism, is a perfect autopsy of systemic failure. One delivery, one automated defense network with no human oversight, one underground cache of nuclear warheads configured to respond to encrypted transponder codes. The NCR's Logistics Corps still teaches it at Camp Charon as a case study in why automation without kill switches is suicide. The Brotherhood of Steel's scribes cataloged every step of the chain reaction. The courier's package contained old Enclave tech that pinged the silo's recognition protocols. The silos, never decommissioned, still linked to dormant satellites in geosynchronous orbit. The warheads still live after 200 years because Vault Tech and the Department of Defense built things to last. It's a textbook scenario now, filed next to the glow and the divide, as what happens when you inherit weapons you don't understand. Followers of the apocalypse researchers use it to argue for complete disarmament. NCR generals use it to argue for tighter control. The Legion doesn't study it at all, because Caesar believes the old world's machines are a corruption that doesn't deserve analysis. Everyone draws the lesson that fits their ideology. But the real lesson wasn't tactical, it was philosophical. Ulysses' warning survives him, whether he lived or died in the divide. It spreads through the Mojave like a virus in the caravan gossip network, in the late-night debates at the Atomic Wrangler, in the whispered doubts of NCR troopers who've seen too many flags planted over too many graves. The idea is simple, and it cuts deep. Any nation that wraps itself in old-world symbols will make old-world mistakes. The NCR hears it and ignores it because they're too invested in the myth of democracy reborn to question whether they're rebuilding or just reskinning the same corpse. The Legion hears it and laughs because Caesar thinks he's transcended the old world by burning it, never realizing he's just another warlord with a philosophy degree and a fetish for Rome. Both empires marching toward the same cliff, convinced their flags make them different. And out in the smaller settlements, in Goodsprings and Novak and the 108, wastelanders who never met Ulysses start asking the question he wanted them to ask. What are we building? Another America, another Rome, or something that might actually survive? It's not a revolution, not yet, just a seed of doubt, planted in radioactive soil, and the courier, knowingly or not, had proven him right. Fast forward 200 years. The divide's still there. The storms haven't calmed, the radiation hasn't faded, and the marked men are still walking their patrols through streets that collapsed before they were born. By then, it might be a salvage site. Desperate scavengers from whatever factions survived the Mojave's wars, picking through the tunnels for pre-war tech that somehow dodged 2 nuclear strikes. Or it stays exactly what it is now, a no-go zone, a place even raiders won't touch. The wasteland will tell stories about it. The place where a courier broke the world twice, where the missiles still wait in their silos, where the ghosts wear old flags like burial shrouds. It'll become mythology, the way Vault 87 did, the way the Glow did. A scar that won't heal, a wound the Mojave keeps picking at, the kind of ruin that makes people wonder what used to be there and whether it was worth it. But that future depends on whether anyone learns from what happened there. Because the divide's real story isn't about a courier or a package or even Ulysses. It's about the old world and how it refuses to die. Centuries after the bombs fell, old world weapons are still killing people. Old world infrastructure is still collapsing on scavengers. Old world ideologies, NCR and Legion, are still grinding each other into the dirt over territory that doesn't matter. Hopeville was built on old world roads. It thrived because of old world trade routes. It died because someone woke up old world nukes that were supposed to stay asleep forever. Every step of the divide's existence, creation to destruction, was the past reaching forward to strangle the present. The marked men are old world soldiers fighting an old world war in an old world base for an old world that's been ash for 200 years. They can't let go because they don't remember what they're holding on to. And the courier walked away carrying the same question Ulysses asked: when does the past finally let go? The divide was supposed to be a road, Hopeville to the Mojave, a shortcut through the mountains, a connection between the coast and the interior, the kind of infrastructure the old world built without thinking, and the new world can barely dream of. It almost worked. For a few years, caravans rolled through, supplies flowed, communities talked to each other, instead of just shooting on sight. A fragile thread of civilization in a region that specializes in tearing those threads apart. Then the road ended, not gradually, not through neglect, but in one afternoon of fire and collapse. And now, it's a monument to every attempt the wasteland makes to build something that lasts. Every trade route that gets raided into extinction, every settlement that starves when the Brahmin die, every alliance that shatters the moment resources get tight. The divide says the wasteland can't sustain the weight of progress, that every road forward is built on a foundation too cracked to hold, that the past is a minefield and the future's a myth people tell themselves to keep walking. But roads can be rebuilt if anyone still believes they're worth the cost. The courier came back once, years after the Mojave settled into whatever passes for peace, after the dam and the choices and the long walk home. They crossed the long 15 with a pack lighter than before, no job waiting, no delivery to make. The storms had quieted some. The marked men were gone or scattered deep into tunnels no one would follow. Hopeville's silhouette still cut the horizon, broken but recognizable, like a scar you stop noticing until you catch it in a mirror. They walked streets they'd walked before, past the high road where the warheads hung silent, past the collapsed overpass and the rail yard where Ulysses had waited. Nothing had changed, nothing ever would. They left a flag, maybe, or a marker, something small that the wind would take in a week. Not a memorial, just proof someone had been there and remembered. And standing where Hopeville once thrived, they understood what Ulysses meant all along. The divide is a wound that never closes. It's the price of carelessness, the cost of symbols, the thing that happens when history moves faster than anyone can track. It's a DLC about consequence in a game built on choice, and it doesn't let you off easy. It's a cautionary tale about infrastructure, about how a single mistake, a package delivered to the wrong place at the wrong time, can erase a community in 6 hours and leave nothing but ghosts and radiation, about how the old world's weapons don't care about intention. It's Ulysses' thesis, delivered in a classroom of rubble, that nations are built on roads, and roads can be destroyed, and maybe the whole project of rebuilding is just setting up the next disaster, that every courier carries something they don't understand. It's personal, a reckoning with the protagonist's past, with the idea that the player character isn't a blank slate, but someone with history, with blood on their hands they didn't know was there. The divide makes you complicit, but meaning is something the wasteland leaves to the living, and the divide still stands. In the end, the divide goes quiet. The machines shut down or run until their fuel cells die. The marked men fade into the tunnels, into the dark, into whatever passes for rest when you're too irradiated to die clean. The wind moves through Hopeville's bones, shifting ash over cracked pavement, rust flaking off metal that won't decay for 200 years. The high road stands empty. The flags, the ones Ulysses planted, bleach white in the sun and tear in the storms until they're threads on a pole. No convoys roll through, no voices echo off the canyon walls. The divide becomes what it always was, underneath the hope and the traffic and the noise. A scar on the map, a place people avoid, a story told in bars to make a point about hubris or fate or the old world's grip. The silos stay sealed or they don't. The warheads wait or they launch. And if they do, someone else will write that chapter. For now, the divide rests. And somewhere in the Mojave, a courier walks on, carrying a message no one wants to hear. In the silo where it all ended, a flag still stands, tattered, faded by ash and wind, planted by Ulysses in the rubble. Bear or bull, whichever you left him with, it doesn't wave anymore. The fabric's too torn, the wind too tired. It's the last thing standing that means anything in the divide, and even that meaning is worn thin. A symbol of a nation that never came, planted by a man who wanted to believe in symbols. The flag was supposed to mark a victory or a warning, but now it just marks a place where people used to argue about the future. You came to the divide looking for answers, and you found a flag in a missile silo. Ulysses told you it mattered, that history and flags and old roads could still mean something. Maybe he was right. Maybe the flag proves people still care enough to plant one in the ashes. Or maybe it just proves that even at the end, we can't let go of the symbols we carried from the old world. Either way, it's still there, outlasting the man who planted it, outlasting the argument, outlasting the last time anyone walked through those tunnels with a purpose. The divide doesn't care about flags, but the flag is there anyway, standing in the ruins, waiting for someone to see it and decide what it means. Here's what happened. Hopeville started as nothing, became a trade hub, and died in 6 detonations. A courier carried a package without reading the label, and the symbols painted on it triggered every warhead buried under the city. Ulysses survived, built a mythology around the disaster, and waited for the courier to return so he could deliver a lecture and a choice. The choice was simple: launch the missiles at the bear or the bull, or Ulysses himself, or shut it all down and walk away. Every option left the divide exactly as ruined as it was before, because the divide was never the point. Ulysses wanted the courier to understand the weight of a careless action. He wanted someone to care about the road they walked and the messages they carried. Whether you talked him down or killed him, the divide stayed a graveyard. The tunnelers kept digging, the marked men kept hunting, and the storms kept tearing through Hopeville's skeleton. The warheads are still there, armed or disarmed, waiting for the next person with a detonator and a reason. You learned that delivery has consequences, that the old world left traps everywhere, and that one man's symbol is another man's Tuesday. The divide taught its lesson. Whether anyone listens is a different question, and the wasteland has never been good at learning from the past. The divide is one scar in a wasteland covered in them. The Mojave has a dozen stories like this, vaults and bunkers and cities that died for reasons people forgot or never knew. This channel covers all of them, the long histories and the short disasters, the factions that rose and the experiments that failed. If you want the complete story of the Brotherhood or the Enclave, the timeline of every vault, the rise and fall of the NCR, it's all here. Calm, thorough, no hype, just the lore laid out the way it happened. Subscribe if you want more Wasteland deep dives, or check the playlist for whatever corner of the fallout you're curious about next. Thanks for walking the divide with me. It's a rough road, but you made it through. The story's told, the flag's still standing, and somewhere out there a courier is delivering another package without asking what's inside. The Wasteland will still be here tomorrow. Rest easy. We'll cover the next chapter when you're ready.